Well, hello. I thought I wanted to simulate what we would do in class with a discussion of Benson's little kind of booklet here on 10 steps to managing change in schools. Um, it is published by ASCD, the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, a very well known and very highly regarded professional association of educators with over 12,000 members. Something you might want to consider. Take a look at the website there, and I think you might find a lot of their professional development, workshop-y kinds of things quite helpful. Okay, so this is not a scholarly work. It has a practitioner focus, so I think that's something to acknowledge. Secondly, I think the usefulness of a checklist, the real down-to-earth kinds of issues, which would help you apply these 10 steps to your particular setting. So, as you know, that's why we start off with the SWOT analysis, the description of your school. What we want is for you to use your own setting, if you will, as a laboratory. So, imagine a situation that needs remediation in your school setting and apply the 10 steps. So let's frame it in that way. I know you've already read it, you've already put in your discussion. We set it up so that your discussion, your own impressions would come before this. But I think it's important to just go through this and again, to begin by thinking about a situation that really needs change and a project that would move that change in the right direction. Okay, so catalyst for change. The whole question of where does catalyst for change come from in schools? Very often it is from higher authorities. That whole question of learning the skill of managing up, mandates from the diocese or from the board in higher education or in non-diocesan kind of networked private Catholic schools who have certain criteria that they want to meet. In some ways, I think, along with regularly kind of ongoing continual improvement, often associated with, for example, accreditation visits, right, become an opportunity. But sometimes I think, we're so afraid of problems or when things don't go right. But sometimes there is a happy fault, Felix Kupel, when things go wrong because they handle the right way. That opens people up to the willingness to take risks, to move forward, and to agree that the status quo could be improved. So we've considered every potential risk except the risk of avoiding all risks. And we know that we're never comfortable with risks and risk-taking, but excellence demands risk. So it's important to clarify positions and interests, forming a common set of interests. And here, when you think of, this is written for a public school K-12 audience, but when you think of, for example, the usefulness of mission statements and they can become kind of tired and routine, but really to articulate deeply held passions of the various people who work within the schools, teachers especially, but all the stakeholders, parents, donors, and students themselves. I think that Catholic schools have a particular benefit in kind of clarifying clarifying interests by the common language about ultimate commitments and purpose, a whole panoply of stories and symbols to tap into people's deeper desires and interests, and the fact that for many who work in Catholic schools, they don't have a job, but they have a vocation. And so that question of not just coming forth with a position, but coming forth with the interest, the deep shared interest related to mission. So how do you turn interests into targets? Well, I think part of it is really understanding the dynamics of change and the various stages of change and the resistance to change. So I'd like you to think back to the lecture on change that I did, which is in Blackboard. And in turning interests into targets, the interests tend to be broad and wide, and the wisdom of choosing the particular target that will be most productive and that will engender the least resistance. Seize control of the data, and I think it's helpful to talk about the three different types of data. And sometimes I think, in my experience with many Catholic schools, sometimes we are, how can I put it, data averse perhaps, or don't have a tradition of data. There are advantages to having kind of an informal, kind of family business type thing, but also I think we need to be aware of data are important and matter, especially in the competitive marketplace that I talked about in the first lecture, the competitive marketplace of educational choice. And people do look for evidence, and evidence comes from data. So to think about your own setting and what kind of institutional data do you have? Well, accreditation reports, for example, would be a place to start. Annual reviews that are done either for the Board of Trustees or for the diocese. In some cases, if there is a capital campaign launched in your school, that would be another place where obviously institutional data would have been collected and assessed to make a strong case to the donor base. Uncollected data, and this, I think, it's important to recognize the fact that, how can I put it, how important it is for a leader to be really perceptive. And it's the ability to get a sense of the place. You know, I suppose in some ways the institutional data, if you've ever done the Myers-Briggs, have you talked, you know, those, when you've looked at the various theories of leadership, right, the Myers-Briggs, some people are sensate. I mean, they recognize all the trees, but they're not intuitive and they don't get the whole forest. And so that ability to kind of get a sense of the culture, the climate, those kinds of uncollected data become especially important when you're trying to make a compelling case for change, which inevitably raises the defensive hackles of people. So, or it could be walk around, it could be talking to people. When you think of the kind of data, for example, if you were to do a formal study of your school, the institutional data, the quantitative measures, right? But then the uncollected data would be more, I suppose, the work of an anthropologist, right? To understand the culture, to understand how people make interpretation of what they see. Isolated data are data that are collected for a particular purpose. Institutional data would be more on a regular basis. Isolated data would be more ad hoc. And so the importance in this managing change in schools is to do surveys. And if you have not already embarked upon that, I think, or not that you have to do it all, but things like SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics, or there are some really wonderful user-friendly ways to survey people to get the kind of ad hoc. And of course, having the data available in a format that is both intelligible and manipulable, technology has created all kinds of opportunities. The other thing about data too, the most difficult data to collect are longitudinal data, but they often yield the most important insights. And so, seizing control of data. Okay. Building a force field. Knowing the players, and while I know for some of you have been in your current position for a while, some of you were kind of brand new. So it's interesting when you reflect on the strategies that you've used to get to know the players, and the various constituencies within the school environment. A certain kind of a willingness to listen to conflicting positions. I think, now, no one likes conflict. Well, people who are pathological like conflict, but psychologically healthy people don't relish conflict. However, living in a way that is just conflict averse is really problematic too. And so, not to be afraid of conflicting positions, and I think especially in our culture currently, where people of opposing positions quickly demonize the other side, and we live in a highly polarized world. So, how do you listen and manage conflicting opinions about important things? In terms of putting together a planning group, the tendency is, I want people to tell me I'm great. No. You want people to be honest, you want people to know, and think about strategy. How do you if you have a team, let's say, doing a planning process, how do you communicate to them, because you're the boss, that you really want to hear conflicting opinions, and you really want them to challenge you? Easier said than done. To anticipate the reactions of people, to moving forward, and that kind of, I suppose, the emotional intelligence piece of leadership becomes important. That how attuned are you to be able to understand and appreciate people's reactions? And I think the analysis or the skills here, the particular situation, to add forces to the staff skills, student skills, etc., on page 25. And these are all forces, of course, that have an impact on the school. And I think when you look at things like staff skills and resources, community resources, parental involvement, regulatory imperatives, impact of social media, we get back to another, again, technology issue, traditions, rules, and policies. Run through that, and I think you looked at a lot of these issues when you did your initial SWOT analysis of your own setting. But I think would you add forces beyond those, or if you were, for example, to prioritize the importance of these various forces within your own situation? There are 10 of them, and what would be number 1? What would be number 10? I think that'd be a helpful exercise. Okay, so frame your efforts. So to think about what should you change in your school, and what needs to be improved. Balance that with what can you change in your school, and that's an important way, again, of thinking of the framing, and where to begin. Now, some of the framing here goes back to Bowman and Deal, and so Benson makes reference to them. Actually, the four-frame approach is something that I first encountered back in fall of 1987. I had Lee Bowman in class, my first year of doctoral studies at Harvard, and he had just developed with Terry Deal this four-frame approach. So seeing the same reality through 4 lenses, that's the basic operative metaphor. I imagine that you have, or certainly you will, see the work of Bowman and Deal to understand organizational analysis, to look through the structural lens, the human resource lens, the symbolic lens, and as I remember having conversations with Lee Bowman, that religious schools, of course, has plenty of material to work with in the symbolic frame, and then the political frame. What it takes is a deftness to be able to get outside of one's habitual way of looking at things, to develop a repertoire. Some people are particularly tuned in, for example, to understanding an organization through the power dynamics of various constituents. Some people would be much more at home looking at predictable and ongoing structures. Other people would see the organization as through the lens of how does the organization meet the emotional and human needs of its constituents. And then the symbolic, and again in a religious institution, I mean, think of your school through the symbolic frame and the power of symbol, be they visual symbols or stories or heroes, what have you. So you want to identify and enhance the driving forces, and you want to identify and neutralize the restraining forces. So it takes, again, we're really talking here about leadership skills. Choose high impact actions. And so that effort impact calculus, I think, is helpful. And, you know, if you're in the upper left-hand quadrant, very important things, but clearly has to be absolutely central to the life of the school because of the kind of effort and energy it takes. High impact, low effort, of course, is ideal on the upper right quadrant. And sadly, the sad reality is there aren't many actions that have the high impact, low effort in the life of institutions. And of course, the bottom two quadrants, low impact, high effort, is fruitless, and low impact, low effort. So if you were to think about this change that you want to make, what strategies would fit into what quadrant? It might be helpful for you to think about that. Okay. Decide who does what. And here, I think, it gets back to this emotional intelligence kind of thing, right? So tell, sell, test, consult, collaborate, and delegate. What are the skills needed to do that? The leadership skills needed to do that. Well, in order to tell, you need to be articulate. In order to sell, you need to be compelling. In order to test, you have to be smart. You have to know data and understand the importance of facts and evidence. To consult, you need to be open and willing to listen to different ways or different perspectives. Collaboration, you're not just the sage on the stage, right? There's a kind of humility in seeing a much more cooperative leadership, distributed leadership, as you remember from the theories that you've looked at. And then finally, to delegate. And have you ever seen a school leader who tries to do it all because he or she, deep down, is convinced that no one else is as competent as he or she is, right? So delegation, while it cuts down on your workload and shares workload, however, it takes a lot of trust. You put together an action plan, and I think the action plan worksheet, some of the issues that are important to notice. Again, clarity. You do not want people reacting to issues that are not relevant. So you need to be clear. There's a timeliness of choosing the right moment. And also action plans need to be specific so that they don't, you can't do everything at the same time. And so really when you think about your own school, right, you should be thinking about, all right, here are the things that need to be addressed. What's most important? What is doable in what time frame? What will create the most defensive postures of people? And so to be specific and to be realistic. And then finally, to sustain the change. I like this Andy Hargreaves, my colleague from Boston College for many, many years and very well known in the leadership world. Change is easy to propose, hard to implement, and especially hard to sustain. So I hope this has been helpful, And again, it's looking at kind of the thoughts of folks in the written word to be able to reflect perhaps in some new ways, I hope, a little bit more deeply about your own setting in particular at the moment. But as you heard through this whole lecture, reflecting upon the theories of leadership and your own identity as a leader. Okay? So, thank you.